Good morning, or good afternoon, or evening to all participants wherever you are. I'm Blaise Conlangan, Chief of the Development Law Branch of the FAO Legal Office. As the facilitator of today's event, I would like to welcome you all to the panel discussion on how can the law support sustainable wildlife management, during which newly developed tools to connect different sources of law and scientific knowledge will also be presented. Before we start, let me share some guidelines on how to engage in this session. First, for those of you who need translation, please click on the translation button at the bottom right corner of the platform screen and select the language you require. Second, from here on, you are invited to post your general reactions in the chat as well as all your questions to our speakers. We will address these in the Q&A sessions. Should you wish, please indicate the name of the panelists to whom you would like to address your question. Both the chat and the question and answer session are on the right of your screen. The chat will be used by the panelists to provide you with supporting information during the webinar. We are keen to hear your views, so please participate and contribute. I see now that we have over 71 participants, about 71 participants. It is therefore time to start. Please allow me to quickly present to you today's panelists as per the order of their interventions. It is my pleasure to announce that we have with us today, first, Ms. Donata Rugarabamu, the legal counsel of FAO, who will be giving the opening remarks. Then we have Philippe Maillot, head of sector, biodiversity and ecosystem services, Director General for International Partnerships, or DG INTPA of the European Commission. Then we will have Eugenio Sartoretto, legal officer, of the Legal Institutional Result Coordinator of the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, SWM. He is also of the Development Law Service of the FAO Legal Office. Then we have Sauli Rabelesoa, Professor of Public Law at the Faculty of Law and Political Science, University of the Antananarivo, Madagascar, and she is also the Senior Legal Consultant of the SWM program in Madagascar. We then have Rina Razavindrabe, who is the Director of Protected Areas, Renewable Natural Resources and Ecosystems, Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development. He is also the national focal point for the SWM program in Madagascar. I would like to recall that the webinar we are hosting today is being organized in the framework of the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program. This is an initiative of the Organization of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, funded by the European Union and co-financed by the French Facility for Global Environment and the French Development Agency, and aims at reconciling wildlife conservation and food security in a set of key landscapes. So before starting today's agenda, I would like to kindly ask Mr. Philippe Maillot, who represents the European Commission as the donor of this program, to give us a quick overview of the program as a whole, and then we will quickly look at the short video of the SWM program. Thank you, Philippe Maillot. You have the floor, please.
Programs in biodiversity conservation since the 80s. In 85, it was exactly the first program in Benin, in the Pendjari. And since then, we have invested a lot of programs, but anyway, despite of all those efforts, the the biodiversity has declined at really alarming rates. And so we have realized that the interlinkages between human development and biodiversity conservation are really essential if we want to maintain the biodiversity. It's not, the biodiversity conservation is not only about trees, only about lions, about elephants, jaguars. No, it's about man first, the humanity and the link between nature and humanity. So that's why we have changed a little bit our view since the 80s. And now we have really put an emphasis on the linkages between the human beings and the nature. 5 years ago, we started the production of a series of books, Larger Than Elephants, on the Larger Than Tigers, and now Larger Than Jaguars. And the title shows that the issue is larger than just the conservation. It's really the link between nature and development. In the current programming phase, because the EU has a programming phase of 7 years, we are launching a series of initiatives called Nature Africa. And in those big landscape, we tackle the biodiversity conservation all together with all the other issues of human development, with agriculture, with energy, with green economy. Because the linkages between the biodiversity and the protected areas and the local communities, including the indigenous people, are really essential. And that's why SWM has a particular place also for us. Clearly, many programs in the past in the EU had a focus on food security and others on biodiversity conservation, and others also on health. And in this case, what is really important that in one single complex and big program, we are tackling all the issues all together. This is a program not on biodiversity, not on food security, not on health, but that's really a program on food security, health, and biodiversity. So that's something really that is essential for us. And you will see some very nice results today, especially in Madagascar. So it's a huge program, 45 million euros, funded by the ACP budget of the European Development Fund. And so working in 15 countries. So the Madagascar, I will not detail, and you can find all the information on the website. But the goal of this program is really to reduce the pressure on the wildlife resources, because by a better management of the wildlife resources in the forest, because local people depend on the wildlife resources and on the wild meat for livelihood, for the food, but also for the micronutrients and other aspects of the livelihood. So that's the first one. Reduction of the consumption in the cities, where the wild meat is not essential for food, but it's more a luxury product, and production of alternative proteins. This is really the three aspects that are essential on the ground. But there is a very important aspect, and we'll discuss on this one today, is the reform of the legal and the regulatory framework. That's really essential. So you must know that this program is led by FAO, but in a consortium with very strong institutions, the CIRAD, CIFOR, and the Wildlife Conservation Society. And this is important because each of them has a particular view. And for us, this issue is so important that we need to put all the experts together. And you can believe me, and you can believe Iber, the coordinator of the program. Sometimes it's not easy to put all those experts in the same room, but that's really a challenge. So I'm really confident that this program that puts really the local communities at the center of the program, of the biodiversity program, by a community-based rights approach, is really a champion for the evolution of many programs, and it will and the strong collaboration with all the national focal points, all the ministries, is really essential, and I'm really confident that we are on the good way. Thank you, Blaise.
Thank you, Philippe, and thank you for the video. Philippe, I think both your intervention and the video have offered us a good overview of the background and context of the SWM program. I want to add that FAO is very privileged and proud to be coordinating the program on behalf of the REACH consortium behind the program. Now, I would like to start the agenda for the present event. For this, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Donata Rugarabamo, the Legal Counsel of FAO, for her introductory remarks. Legal Counsel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Blaise. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone, wherever you may be. It is a true pleasure to be with you. To turn to the more substantive now part of my opening remarks. As all of you are very well aware, legislation is an important tool used by governments to clearly set out rights and responsibilities of actors, that is, right holders and duty bearers. Also to protect rights holders and enforce against breach of rights and duties. Legislation is key to achieving change and is essential for enabling and supporting sustainable food and agricultural production, as well as the effective management and sustainable use of natural resources, including wildlife. However, public perception of the law may vary depending on the national context. For example, instead of law being seen as an agent of change and a source of order in society, it can be viewed as irrelevant, a matter for lawyers, or an instrument of control or punishment. This may lead some to question the legitimacy of the law and its relevance to livelihoods and sustainable development. A key means of correcting these misperceptions is to ensure that the law review and the development process is transparent, consultative, and participatory. The exploitation of natural resources and the use of natural resources and the related supply value chains involves a multiplicity of actors with different interests and different roles to play. They involve a complex web of relationships, particularly between the authorities and those whose activities are to be regulated, the members of society who should, in fact, ultimately benefit from the existence and application of such laws. Once again, I would repeat broad participation in the law review and development process, which takes into account cultural sensitivities, that is transparent and participatory, ensuring that representatives of the full range of stakeholders are involved in the process is crucial. Other than this, both natural and social scientific evidence, knowledge, and good practice should inform how a law should be molded. In the case of sustainable wildlife management, the law needs to ensure cross-sectoral objectives that may seem conflicting, but that they are all met. These include wildlife remains a sustainable source of food and livelihood of those who depend upon them, but wildlife species are protected and future epidemics caused by the spillover of diseases from wildlife to humans are protected. As I said, a complex cross-sectoral objectives which collectively need to be met together. So ideally, legislative reform should build upon and strengthen current laws, and in particular, those aspects which should adequately address their intended purpose and recognize legal pluralism. These include customary norms and practices where they exist, and in certain circumstances, particularly in rural areas, customary norms and practices are the source of order and harmonious relationships. These may be strengthened through formal recognition and invigorate flexible and responsive governance systems to ensure that natural resources, including wildlife, can be managed efficiently. The coexistence and interaction of all of these elements, which are brought to bear on the law review and the development process, ensures that laws are fit for purpose, that they are relatively easier to implement and make for better compliance, rendering law enforcement a rarity or indeed as a last resort. Law in such a context will be credited as an agent for transformational change and thus perpetuating its enabling function. The need for comprehensive and practical national legal frameworks as drivers for change in approaches and behavior towards sustainable resource use, improving livelihoods, food security and nutrition, and in alleviating poverty is vital, particularly in light of the UN 2030 agenda, and the global SDGs. This has been emphasized as well in the FAO governing bodies. For example, in the 156th session of the FAO Council, as well as the urgency of addressing the COVID-19 pandemic's multiple negative effects on food system towards more sustainable and resilient models. And it is in this context and against this background that the Legal Office of FAO welcomed Result 1 as one of the 7 pillars of the SWM program, giving prominence to the role of law in ensuring sustainable management of wildlife, as well as to help in preventing future outbreaks of animal-borne diseases. This is also in line with FAO's new strategic framework 2022-2031, which is currently being finalized by our member states, which highlights the importance of having in place stronger, more transparent and accountable institutions and governance, both requiring supporting laws and regulations. This is specifically highlighted by our members at this time. It is also pleasing to see the Development Law Service of the Legal Office of FAO as host of the coordinator of Result 1 and ensuring quality control of the legal activities and their outputs under the SWM program. The Legal Office is a keen follower of the SWM program as a whole, and in particular, the progress and achievements of Result 1. Indeed, I personally would testify to that. I follow this with tremendous interest and great excitement. It is a pleasure, in fact, to have been witness to and part of the legal diagnostic tools and related outputs which will be presented today. And the Legal Office is confident that the tools that have been developed under Result 1 not only helps the SWM program realize its objectives, but will also have long-term use in other areas of activity of FAO, and I hope the other organizations which partner with us in this very, very exciting and innovative program. We believe that the approach and the methodology in developing the diagnostic tool and the tool itself could be used for law review and development in food and agriculture and other natural resource sectors as well. I think at this point, I will close my remarks. It has been a pleasure to make them. I look forward to joining with you and interacting with you during this seminar, this webinar. And with that, I wish you a successful webinar, and I hand back to you, Blaise.
Thank you very much, Donata. That has been the legal counsel of the FAO. Donata, as you know, we are very grateful on behalf of the program for your own personal support and that of the legal office. And your remarks have added another useful context for this event, which is really appreciated. Thank you. At this point, Philip, I would like to come back to you with a question. As you said earlier, the European Union has been firm in wanting the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program to address a conservation concern that is clearly, as they say, larger than elephants. You have also insisted that the program builds on a result dedicated to the legal and institutional work. So my question is, could you please tell us why you think the legal work is important and what the challenges are relating to the legal and institutional framework which should be addressed in the countries where the program operates? Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Blaise. That's a challenging question because I'm not a lawyer. Nobody's perfect. I'm just a scientist. And but as the FAO Legal Counsel expressed, indeed, there's a strong linkages between the role of scientific empirical knowledge and also traditional knowledge to include in the decision making, and it must be, and the law is also is probably the best vehicle to do it. But I will a bit elaborate on that. In the impact of the SWIM program will also be the fact that we are working in 13 countries, 13 sites, and with natural scientists, social scientists. So that's really a big ambition per se. But the impact will be anyway limited in geography and in time to those sites. If we don't expand it through the to the entire population, to the entire ACP countries. And for that, we need really a strong legal component. So that's really the way we can touch a big number of stakeholders that will benefit from the program. And that's, as we are spending public money, we need to guarantee the best impact. So, and for that, we need really a change in the mindset of all the stakeholders, and we see it also internally in the Commission. Some people believe that when you produce a rule, a norm, it will change automatically the behavior and the world, if I can say like that. Others believe that if you have nice programs, if you have nice field activities, you will also have a strong impact. Actually, you need the two, and so that's why we need the synergy between a strong synergy between the sciences, if you want, the applied sciences and the law. And the governance is really an axis where the EU has always insisted. I remember even in previous programming cycle, the Commissioner Louis Michel imposed the governance as one of the 2 or 3 key sectors for each country. But the governance is really abstract. Here we have a good example of how we can improve the governance in the natural resource domain, and even more especially in the wild meat domain. So that's something really interesting. But human rights and rule of law, it's really part of the DNA of the EU. It was based on that. And so that's something that we will insist in all the programs, and including in the biodiversity conservation program. Sometimes I say that EU with the Green Deal now, which is extremely present since 1 year, as a big priority of the European Union. EU has a DNA with the 2 branches, and the first one is more the human rights and the 2 strands, I guess, in genetics, it's how you call it. The human rights on one side and the Green Deal on the other side. And between the 2 strands of the DNA, you have the possibility to have linkages, and you need the linkages. So that's exactly why we need to work all together. What is important also is that it's quite complex to develop this framework, and we need the participatory approach also for the law review and the development, because as was said by Donata, indeed, if you want to increase the ownership of the law, you need to involve people from the very beginning in this review and in this development. And this law will have a strong impact on the forest of the forest people, so they need to be involved from the very beginning. And on the other hand, you need also to involve strong national partners, because you need the consistency, the internal consistency with the other parts of the law in the country. It's the worst thing to do is to have a conflict between maybe the mining, the law applied to mines and the law applied to protected areas. As it is the case, sometimes you have conflicts even in the tenure between the different land use. And so we need really a strong clarification at national level. What is also important is to be sure that we have this compliance between the national and even sometimes the local norms and the international commitments. In 6 months now, we will negotiate the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Wildlife will be one of the subjects on the table. So we need to be sure that we are not too ambitious internationally, and it's not applicable on the ground. And on the other hand, that the local concerns are translated in the international norm. So that's something that we need really to work a lot with that. The challenges here, it's also that on these traditional resources like wild meat, you have traditional knowledge, you have traditional norms, and you have also what do you call it, classical or formal governance systems. And to combine the two, it's sometimes a challenge, and I recognize that it is really something very important, especially in all the swim countries where the traditional norms are very essential. and sometimes can be different from one ethnic group to another. So it's something extremely complex, and I realize that you have really a difficult challenge. Last point, I would like also to insist on the implementation of the law, and to understand how we can really improve the implementation. It's also by understanding why it's not well implemented. So that's a part also of the challenge. So it was a long answer, but I think the question was really challenging. Blaise, next time, please be more kind with me.
Thank you very much, Philippe. We know, well, I think I agree with you on the need for the work on the legal and institutional framework to ensure that they're done together to ensure a successful model, whether it be wildlife or any other natural resource management. And this would ensure sustainability and should survive the closure or the end of a development project. But what you've done is you've touched on a key issue that for me, and that is the need for law and science to interact, work together in tandem. And this is a process we are familiar with within FAO, but now with the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, it has given us the opportunity to dig deeper and focus on this modality. So now I have a question which I would like to address to Eugenio. Eugenio, we have, as coordinator of the legal work under the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, I would like for you to explain what is it that the SWM program has done and is still doing to address the challenges that have been presented, and in a particular way, how this work should bring together law, science, and traditional knowledge.
So I should probably start by saying that the main difficulty we face was to find a way to address all those challenges simultaneously, because in most cases they operate at different levels at the same time. This is the case of national and international obligations, but also of statutory and customary norms. The result is a complex pattern of rules with sometimes important disconnects that are difficult to reconcile and that might determine an important wound to the rule of law. It is within this framework and with the aim of being as comprehensive as possible that within the legal institutional result team of the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program, whose members are actually here among the panelists to respond to any of your questions afterwards, we developed 5 legal diagnostic tools and relevant methodologies. Let me please present quickly those few through a PowerPoint presentation. So, as you can see from this scheme, these tools are all interlinked and interrelated, and have been used by national legal consultants across all the countries where the program operates to develop comprehensive legal baseline studies. Now, the first tool aims to map the existing legal instruments regulating wildlife management across sectors. This is crucial, especially in those countries where the publication of acts in the official gazette we know is discontinuous, and legislative drafting techniques are either inaccurate or ambiguous. This determines indeed legal uncertainty in terms of applicable legislation. The use of this tool has allowed us to identify existing gray areas, such as obsolete provisions, ambiguities, as well as the ongoing legal reforms, and has clarified the current applicable legal and regulatory framework. The second tool aims to review how state obligations arising from international agreements are reflected in the national legal framework. This is not a compliance assessment tool, but rather offers a comparison of national legislation with the corresponding obligation of applicable international instruments. The tool is limited to 5 main international environmental conventions and 2 protocols. that are legally binding. They are the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, the Convention on Migratory Species, the World Heritage Convention, the Convention on Wetlands, and the Convention on Biodiversity, of course, with its two protocols, Nagoya and Cartagena. Plus, which we thought was extremely relevant in the context of wildlife management, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Yet, what is important is that the conceptual framework that we developed can be easily extended beyond those 5 instruments to also include regional as well as non-binding instruments. Now, for the third tool, that was designed to provide a cross-sectoral analysis of the national legal framework applicable to wildlife and to identify gaps and inconsistencies, I will rather give the floor to a short video support that we developed as part of the Result One team of the SWM program for this very purpose.
L'annexe 2B est un outil conçu pour analyser l'ensemble des règles juridiques nationales relatives à la gestion de la faune sauvage qui ont été préalablement rassemblées dans l'annexe 1. Il concerne toute la chaîne de valeur et couvre 7 thématiques. Les 4 premières sont propres à la faune sauvage. Il y a d'abord une thématique générale qu'on appelle « conditions préalables » qui permet de comprendre quels sont les droits sur la terre et sur la faune sauvage, à qui ils appartiennent et comment ces ressources sont gérées et aménagées. Ensuite, on a 3 thématiques plus spécifiques. Les 2 premières sur les utilisations qu'on peut faire de la faune sauvage, avec la chasse, la pêche, mais aussi les usages qu'on appelle hors consommation comme l'écotourisme, et une 3e qui porte sur la gestion des conflits homme-faune. À ces 4 premières thématiques s'ajoute une thématique sur la production animale, donc l'élevage et l'aquaculture, puis 2 autres thématiques qui sont communes à la faune sauvage et aux animaux domestiques. Il s'agit de la santé animale et de la sécurité sanitaire des aliments, c'est-à-dire les normes d'hygiène applicables à la transformation et à la distribution de la viande et du poisson. Pour chacune de ces 7 thématiques, l'objectif est de répondre à des questions précises, pratiques, en identifiant à chaque fois tous les textes de loi et règlements pertinents. Près de 650 questions ont été posées afin de mieux comprendre quelles sont les mesures qui existent dans le cadre juridique national, quels sont les éventuels vides juridiques, c'est-à-dire les sujets qui ont été laissés de côté ou pour lesquels il manque des textes d'application, et enfin, quels sont les potentiels conflits entre les différentes lois sectorielles. Par exemple, le Code forestier prévoit quelque chose, alors que la loi sur la faune ou sur la pêche prévoit autre chose. Pour chaque thématique et sous-section, un résumé reprend également les principales règles applicables, les potentiels vides juridiques et les conflits. Le tout s'accompagne enfin d'une liste des institutions et de leurs principales fonctions et compétences. Le premier intérêt d'un tel outil, c'est de permettre à chacun d'avoir un accès direct et opérationnel à l'état du droit applicable. Les utilisateurs qui se demandent « Qu'est-ce que le système juridique prévoit sur tel aspect de la gestion de la faune sauvage ?» pourront, en un clic, visualiser toutes les règles sectorielles applicables à cet aspect particulier, ce qui devrait encourager une gestion intégrée des écosystèmes. Cela permettra également de faire des comparaisons entre les secteurs et d'identifier les bonnes pratiques afin d'améliorer le cadre juridique. En effet, le second intérêt de l'outil, c'est qu'il permet d'obtenir une analyse des forces et des faiblesses du cadre juridique national, ainsi qu'un socle de connaissances générales sur la gestion de la faune sauvage et sur la production animale. Ces 2 éléments vont être utiles non seulement pour construire les annexes 3 et 4, qui portent respectivement sur le droit coutumier et sur la mise en œuvre et l'application effective de la loi, mais également pour développer éventuellement dans le futur des analyses sur des sujets connexes. Par exemple, si on souhaite s'intéresser au concept « une seule santé », on pourra tout à fait rajouter des thématiques environnement ou santé publique aux 7 thématiques déjà étudiées dans l'annexe 2B. Enfin, le fait d'avoir appliqué les mêmes outils à différents pays facilitera l'analyse comparative des systèmes juridiques de ces pays.
Voilà, donc super. In my screen, the video wasn't very clear, it was slightly blurry. If that was the case for others, apologies. But yes, let me please clarify that these kind of videos, similar videos exist for all the tools I'm describing. and are actually accessible through the QR code that you can easily scan from the poster you have received along with the invitation to this webinar. Actually, I'm just seeing now that Alessandra has just posted the link to those posters on the chat, so please download them in case you want to have access to more videos. Considering that below the videos, you can also download methodologies and the tools that I'm presenting. So the last two tools were developed to better understand customary rules and practices and the barriers to implementation and enforcement of wildlife legislation. In this regard, the fourth tool provides a framework to identify, understand, and document the right of indigenous people and local communities to land, as well as to associated natural resources, in this case, wildlife, as well as the multiple challenges associated with promoting the recognition of customary rights. Finally, the fifth tool is the fifth tool was designed to identify the structural and conjunctural factors that explain the insufficient or lack of implementation and enforcement of certain legal instruments in a given jurisdiction. Actually, the use of this specific tool at a larger scale is for us of particular importance prior to the initiation of any legislative reform process, as it will allow conclusion to be drawn that can further inform it. These latter tools were informed by field survey conducted by local legal consultant and social scientist or anthropologist. And their outcome is specific to the site where they are being implemented and should therefore not be extended beyond these geographic areas. Yet they can, of course, be replicated in any other area. The result of the first three tools I've presented have been shared in framework of the program and the work we're doing in most countries with government counterparts, including all representative of the relevant line ministries. This was done in order to gather their contributions and feedback. Yet, this step has allowed us to consolidate our findings, as well as to raise awareness of officials on gaps and weaknesses on sector-specific legislation. By doing so, we contributed in the framework of the program so-called community right-based approach that was mentioned earlier, to strengthen the capacity of duty bearers who have a particular obligation or responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights of local communities. In the framework of this very approach, awareness-raising activities to the benefit of local right-holding communities are also being planned for the upcoming month, using appropriate communication material based on comprehensive legal country profiles that are developed based on the 5 tools that I've described. These profiles will be also available further on the Legal Hub. The Legal Hub that we are actually launching today is a section of the Sustainable Wildlife Management Program web portal and contains the result of our legal analysis. And please, I'll be grateful if you can follow me on a short journey across these new assets. So the Legal Hub is available in English and French and will be regularly updated. It currently provides easy access to the instruments and analysis obtained from the first 3 tools I've mentioned, namely the tools for mapping relevant statutory legal frameworks, for reviewing domestication of relevant international instruments, and for analyzing consistency across sectoral legislation and identify potential gaps. Yet, the user is also given access to the 2 other aforementioned tools and methodologies. I see someone in the chat was asking whether this tool would be accessible. The answer is yes. You can easily download tool and methodology from the main page of the Legal Hub. So by scrolling down the Legal Hub on page, one can access each country's specific page through the word map. Now, the Legal Hub is currently featuring only Madagascar, but will be progressively populated with all countries where the program operates. I expect Zimbabwe to be uploaded before the end of this month, to be followed by Congo and Gabon relatively soon. Each country page starts with a section summarizing the historical and political context. This is followed by a legal database organized by sector, where the user can access and download all relevant policies, laws, and regulations. This section is actually informed by the result of the first tool I mentioned, the mapping tool. Because of the high volume of text available per each country, consider that only Madagascar we gather more than 400 text. The user can easily filter down the search by keywords or by type of text. At the center of the Legal Hub is the analysis of the statutory laws. That, as you can see, is divided into sectors, covering the full hunting and fishing value chains, from preconditions, which include land tenure and planning, to food safety, and also including animal production and animal health. So it's not just something for hunters or fishers. Each sector is organized alike and offers, after a general overview, a more detailed description of the applicable legal regime of the relevant sub-team. Now, for those who want to dig deeper, there's always lawyers who want to dig deeper on legal references. You can easily click on diagnostic questions key to have access to the full range of questions and legal references that were taken directly from the legal tool on strengths and weaknesses that is actually informing the above content. Each country page also includes a section dedicated to the relevant international instruments, the one I mentioned earlier, which is built on the diagnostic tool that, again, I introduced beforehand. For each, we have a list of all existing provisions of the national legal framework that domesticate the corresponding obligations. The full legal text are also accessible from here, should you wish to download it. Yeah, finally, the Legal Hub offers a quick overview of the relevant national institutions, including a summary of their mandates, roles, and responsibilities across sectors. So overall, we believe the Legal Hub will be of interest to many people, not just to lawyers. It contains information that will be valuable, particularly for scientists, but also to private sectors, policymakers, NGOs, and civil society organizations, beside, of course, government. The aim is to provide a single and easy access point to legal text and analysis that will increase public awareness and encourage informed and participative law reform processes to strengthen sustainable wildlife management. So the work described above and reflecting the Legal Hub will help bridging, in our view at least, bridging laws with scientific and customary knowledge. In its broader sense, spanning from formal, natural, as well as social sciences. By disaggregating and making accessible the content of sectoral legislation, the Hub will allow a better and more constructive interaction between stakeholders, different stakeholders with different backgrounds. The Legal Hub is designed to be user-friendly and to facilitate linkages between different sectors, sources of law and knowledge. We really hope that this will help preventing, detecting, but also responding in an appropriate and cross-sectoral manner to the multiple challenges of sustainable wildlife management, including to the risk of diseases emerging from wildlife, in line, of course, with the One Health approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eugenio. That was very interesting, but also a lot of information, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions now from participants in relation to the tools and methodologies that you have presented. And then the responses to these might offer a much clearer framework to operate legal assessments across sectors and systems. Now, I'm now curious because I think the tools are useful, but it can become clear only if we get them tested at the country level. So I'll be keen to know how these tools and the kind of process that were triggered to use them. And therefore, for this, I'll be taking all of you to Madagascar, and particularly to Makira, to have a more concrete overview and the application of these tools. Before giving the floor to Ms. Rabelizoa for her presentation, let me just play a short video produced by the SWM program on the work in Madagascar. It is interesting. I ask for your attention to this video. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, turning to Ms. Sauli Rabelizoa, as I've told you before, Sauli is our counterpart, the lead lawyer for implementing the tools that have been presented in Madagascar. Ms. Rabelizoa, could you tell us about your experience on using these tools? And in addition to that, do you have any specific examples of the main findings and how they have paved the ground to inform legislative reform process in your country?
Rebonjour tout le monde. Merci beaucoup de m'avoir donné la parole. Tout d'abord, avant de faire ma présentation, je tiens à remercier l'organisateur et également je vous remercie d'avance pour les questions que vous avez posées à la fin de mon intervention. Tout d'abord, par rapport à, je suis le représentant des consultants à Madagascar pour présenter les outils de diagnostic juridique pour la mise en œuvre du programme SWIM à Madagascar. Par rapport au contexte du pays, Madagascar est caractérisé par plusieurs ethnies, mais avec une forte homogénéité linguistique et culturelle. En matière de biodiversité, le pays est reconnu par son fort taux d'endémicité de la faune. C'est un État unitaire avec un système juridique à la fois civiliste et coutumier. Ça veut dire que le droit coutumier est reconnu par le droit statutaire et ça, c'est depuis le temps des royautés. La conséquence de cette reconnaissance du droit coutumier par le droit statutaire pose quelques conditions, dont notamment, il faut que la coutume soit conforme aux lois et règlements en vigueur et aux bonnes mœurs. En conséquence, les juges, en face des litiges entre les parties, peuvent se référer à la coutume des parties, mais à condition que cette coutume respecte les bonnes mœurs et les lois en vigueur. En matière d'exemples de coutumes, on peut citer le DIN, qui est reconnu légalement depuis 2001 qui est consacré par un texte spécifique sur le din, mais la condition d'application de ce din, qui est un droit coutumier, est qu'il faut que ce din soit contrôlé par le juge par rapport à sa conformité aux bonnes mœurs et aux lois en vigueur. Il y a également la loi sur le transfert de gestion locale des ressources naturelles renouvelables, dite GELOZ, qui reconnaît le din comme instrument de gestion durable des ressources naturelles par la communauté de base qui sont bénéficiaires de ce transfert de gestion des ressources. En matière de site d'intervention du projet SWIM, le parc Makir est situé dans le nord-est de Madagascar, à cheval entre 3 régions. Elle a été créée par décret juridique en 2012. C'est une gestion déléguée à WCS, c'est-à-dire que l'État reste le propriétaire de ce site, mais il a délégué la gestion à WCS, qui est également l'institution responsable de mise en œuvre du projet SWIM à Madagascar. Le modèle de gestion est un modèle de gestion durable et la population concernée par ce site peuvent être divisées en 2 parties. D'une part, la population qui réside dans le parc, au sein même du parc, dans ce qu'on appelle zone d'occupation contrôlée, parce que l'État a décidé de ne pas expulser ces populations pour les préserver. Donc, ces populations peuvent résider dans la zone d'occupation contrôlée sous condition de respecter les cahiers des charges qui sont figurés aussi dans le din. Il y a également la population qui réside aux alentours, c'est-à-dire dans les ceintures vertes de l'aire protégée. Et ce sont ces populations-là qu'on appelle communautés de base ou COPA, et ils sont bénéficiaires du transfert de gestion locale des ressources naturelles qu'on appelle GELOS, que j'ai cité auparavant, et les modalités de ce contrat de gestion sont figurées dans, il y a aussi le din qui renferme les droits et obligations de ces COBA. Par rapport au retour d'expérience sur les outils juridiques, comme on a déjà exposé tout à l'heure, Eugenio l'a expliqué que plus de 400 textes ont été collectés, classés par secteur et mis en forme numérique. Mais un des points forts du projet SWIM, c'est qu'il y a plusieurs contenus de ces textes qui ne sont pas accessibles, c'est-à-dire seulement ce sont les références qui sont figurées dans le site officiel de publication des journaux officiels à Madagascar, qui est le Centre national de légistique, mais bon nombre, dans environ 150 textes, le contenu ne sont pas accessibles. Et le point fort du projet SWIM, c'est que maintenant, le contenu de ces textes sont accessibles sur le site du projet SWIM parce que les consultants ont dû chercher le contenu de ces textes dans les bibliothèques et dans les départements ministériels responsables. À l'issue de ces analyses de l'annexe 1 et également des annexes 2A et 2B, on a fait une analyse transversale de tous ces textes. Tout d'abord, recensement des conventions internationales ratifiées par Madagascar et ensuite, on a analysé les forces et faiblesses de la mise en œuvre de ces conventions internationales à Madagascar. Il y avait eu des incohérences internes et externes, des vides juridiques par rapport à ces textes analysés. On a aussi identifié les points d'intérêt communs entre les différents secteurs et cherché les modalités de synergie en vue de la gestion intégrée des fonds sauvages. Des recommandations y afférentes ont été abordées dans le cadre du projet. Par rapport à le tour d'expérience des activités sur le terrain, notamment l'annexe 3 et l'annexe 4, avant la descente sur le terrain, une revue de littérature existante a été faite par de consultants juristes. Donc, on a contribué avec le coordonnateur du site SWIM à Madagascar, avec les responsables du projet SWIM. On a identifié quelques textes, mais pas tous les 400 textes qu'on a identifiés. On a sélectionné les principaux textes qui peuvent concerner le site qui va faire l'objet d'entretiens. On a identifié également les différents acteurs, aussi bien étatiques que non étatiques, qui peuvent être concernés par ces entretiens. Et on a également développé, en concertation avec les responsables cités tout à l'heure, des protocoles et de questionnaires pour guider la conduite des entretiens. Il y avait eu, par rapport à l'annexe 4, l'enquête a été faite dans la ville de Marantsich avec des acteurs étatiques et non étatiques. Et pour l'annexe 3, c'est-à-dire la spécifique au droit coutumier, on a descendu sur le site et cette fois-ci, le consultant juridique a été accompagné par une anthropologue avec l'appui du WCS pour descendre sur deux sites, les deux sites de Makir, notamment Marfoufounen et Marantsich. Donc, l'expérience, le retour d'expérience sur l'annexe 4, c'est-à-dire la mise en œuvre des textes juridiques, et l'annexe 3 sur le droit coutumier, a permis de constater, d'identifier comment le texte est perçu et appliqué au niveau des acteurs non étatiques et étatiques dans la ville de Marantsich. Les acteurs, on a identifié, on a enquêté, fait des entretiens pour les acteurs étatiques, notamment le chef de district, les magistrats, les secteurs privés, les gestionnaires des parcs. Et pour les acteurs non étatiques, on a consulté les notables locaux, les communautés de base, etc. Donc, par rapport à ces entretiens effectués sur le terrain, donc aussi bien sur le site que dans la ville de Marantsich, on a constaté que sur le plan logistique, les deux sites visités qu'on a visités sont relativement enclavés. Donc, on a mis beaucoup plus de temps pour s'y rendre et le temps de 7 jours de mission est relativement très court pour comprendre vraiment l'application du droit coutumier lié à la gestion des fonds sauvages. On a également constaté comme limite par rapport à cette mission de terrain de visite sur le site qu'il y avait eu la présence des agents du WCS qui nous a beaucoup aidé pour la réalisation de ces missions, mais certaines personnes ont eu vraiment leur présence pourrait avoir influencé les réponses de certaines personnes qui ont fait l'objet d'entretiens. En ce qui concerne les aperçus des résultats des outils juridiques par rapport aux droits statutaires, on a constaté une faible réglementation du transport et de la vente de produits des chasses. On a également constaté le flou du statut juridique de la faune sauvage vivante. Et comme Madagascar actuellement est victime de la criminalité environnementale, donc on a constaté dans la loi qui réglemente, la loi de mise en œuvre de la CITES à Madagascar, qu'il y a très peu de dispositions pour cette lutte contre la criminalité des faunes sauvages à Madagascar, dont notamment l'absence des mécanismes dans ces dispositifs, l'absence de dispositions sur la lutte contre les corruptions. Il y a également un phénomène d'insécurité juridique parce qu'il y a un texte datant de 1962 sur la détention des lémuriens qui est encore en vigueur, alors que la loi CITES réglemente également la détention des lémuriens. Donc, cette existence de deux textes applicables en même temps met les utilisateurs et particulièrement les juges dans les incertitudes. Il y a également une faible prise en compte des espèces migratrices, notamment la protection des oiseaux d'eau. Et enfin, il y a beaucoup de textes qui n'ont pas de texte d'application à ce jour, même si ceux-ci ont été adoptés depuis 2006 dans le texte relatif à l'élevage. Par rapport au droit coutumier, c'est-à-dire l'annexe 3, on a pu constater que la religion et la scolarisation ont affaibli, ont relativement affaibli les pratiques coutumières. Pour illustration de cette relativement faible de l'application du droit coutumier, lorsqu'on a enquêté, fait des entretiens avec les gens et quand on a regardé des instruments de gestion durable à la disposition des communautés locales ou des communautés de base, on a constaté que c'est le droit statutaire, notamment le Code des aires protégées, l'ordonnance relative à la chasse qui est datée de 1962 et d'autres textes statutaires. Ce sont ces textes-là qui sont intégrés dans ces instruments de gestion qui est entre les mains des populations locales et non pas leur droit des usages et leur droit d'usage. Donc, ce phénomène de disparition du droit coutumier peut s'expliquer par le fait que souvent, surtout en matière de droit foncier forestier, il y a eu d'abord, avant la colonisation, la propriété clanique du foncier forestier. Puis, en 1960, après l'indépendance, on a adopté une loi domaniale comme quoi les forêts appartiennent à l'État. Et actuellement, le statut foncier du parc Makir est un espace protégé. C'est-à-dire que c'est l'État même qui est propriétaire des forêts, mais cet changement de statut est relativement flou pour les populations locales. Il y a également, on a constaté également une faible participation des femmes dans la gestion des ressources naturelles. Et on a constaté également lors de notre entretien sur l'annexe 3 l'absence de dispositifs sur la protection des espèces menacées et qui sont pourtant endémiques à Madagascar, à l'exemple de Foussa. Par rapport à l'annexe 4, on a constaté un manque de représentativité des communautés de base qui sont quand même les gestionnaires, des bénéficiaires de gestion des ressources naturelles dans le cadre de la loi GELOS, et on a vu une capture des élites locaux dans ces structures. Il y a également, dans le cadre de mécanismes de partage des avantages et dans le cadre du processus RED+, on a constaté un manque d'effectivité de ce processus et une faible transparence de ce mécanisme. Par rapport aux agents responsables de la constatation des infractions, notamment les officiers de police judiciaire et les magistrats, on a constaté surtout un manque crucial d'effectifs et un manque de formation de ces principaux responsables. Il y a également, on a constaté également un manque de connaissance des populations sur les lois et règlements et particulièrement sur leurs droits relatifs aux fonciers. Il y a également un manque d'intégration du droit coutumier dans le droit statutaire et inversement. Ainsi, quelques pistes d'amélioration sont proposées pour le droit statutaire. Il convient d'introduire une révision périodique du classement des espèces de faune sauvage pour pouvoir y intégrer, pour les mettre en contexte, à l'exemple de la liste rouge de la Convention CITES et autres. Il convient également de réviser le Code des aires protégées et l'ordonnance sur la chasse qui date de 62. Il convient de signaler que cette ordonnance sur la chasse est actuellement en cours de révision par le projet SWIM. Il y a également l'importance de poursuivre le travail d'évaluation et de la réforme de la loi GELOS pour intégrer mieux clarifier les droits de la population locale liés à ce transfert de gestion et les mettre en contexte surtout avec l'approche foncière parce que le foncier est étroitement lié à la gestion durable de la faune. Il y a également, comme lors de notre entretien sur le terrain, nous avons appris que le guichet foncier, c'est-à-dire la propriété privée non titrée, qui donne compétence à la commune pour attribuer un certificat foncier, est en cours. Le certificat foncier reconnaît la propriété coutumière des populations locales au travers un certificat foncier dont la compétence est attribuée au maire. Or, on a constaté que les formations et la compréhension de ce concept relativement nouveau, parce qu'adopté en 2006 à Madagascar, est faiblement approprié par cette instance locale. En matière de droit coutumier, il convient d'assurer la formation des personnes non membres des communautés de base, mais pas seulement les communautés de base, parce que lors de notre entretien sur le terrain, on a pu constater que ce sont principalement les membres du COBA qui ont fait l'objet d'entretiens. Par rapport à la participation de femmes qui sont déterminantes dans la gestion durable de la faune, il convient d'assurer l'incitation de ces dernières pour mieux contribuer aux affaires qui touchent la gestion durable des ressources naturelles et également assurer leur éducation et leur information. Comme la communauté de base joue un rôle très, très important dans le transfert de gestion dans le cadre de la loi GELOS, il convient également d'assurer la formation de ces communautés de base dans la gestion et surtout dans la valorisation des ressources naturelles pour améliorer leurs conditions de vie. Et bien sûr, toutes ces formations de la population locale doivent être appropriées à leur niveau d'instruction, mais pas des formations écrites sur la table et n'est pas adaptée au contexte des apprenants. Par rapport à l'annexe 4, il convient d'augmenter l'accès au droit à Madagascar parce que c'est tellement difficile cet accès au droit. Le problème, c'est que ce n'est pas seulement le niveau numérique, c'est-à-dire l'accès sur Internet, parce que la majorité des régions de Madagascar est relativement difficile d'accès sur Internet. Donc, il convient de se référer au discours Oukabar et au DIN. Ces deux outils sont reconnus depuis la période monarchique que ce sont des instruments de diffusion du droit. Et après l'indépendance de 1962, ces outils coutumiers sont reconnus comme moyen de diffusion de droit par un texte de 1962, au même titre que le journal officiel. Il y a également lieu de sensibiliser les acteurs de terrain pour que ceux-ci...
Sauli,
Oui, j'ai dépassé.
please, could you conclude, please, because we are running behind our time, please. Thank you.
OK. Pour conclure, une démarche durable est vraiment essentielle pour assurer la mise en œuvre du droit à Madagascar. Là où je veux dire, c'est qu'une cohabitation entre le droit moderne et le droit coutumier est très importante. Ce n'est pas seulement le droit coutumier qui doit être exigé, doit être conforme au droit moderne et aux bonnes mœurs, mais pour être applicable, mais le droit statutaire ne peut jamais être applicable s'il n'est pas accepté et suivi selon le droit coutumier. Donc, une cohabitation entre les deux est vraiment indispensable. Ensuite, comme le droit n'est pas la chose des juristes, une forte corrélation et une approche pluridisciplinaire avec les sciences, le sens de la société et le droit est indispensable pour la gestion durable de la faune et le bien-être humain. Merci beaucoup.
I'm cutting you short, but we are behind time, so we have to manage a bit well. But I would like to thank you very much for this very instructive presentation. We know it is relevant to see how a tool is being tested and how many different aspects have been identified as potentially relevant to sustainable wildlife management in a given country. We think this strengthens the importance of a holistic approach, which you have mentioned, to law review, and that this approach also breaks down silos generally created by sectorial legislation, but also giving and invigorating customary uses and practices that constitute very often the main forms of governance in rural areas. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Rina Razavindrab, Director of Renewable Natural Resources and Ecosystems Management from the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Madagascar, and to ask him this question.
Merci Blaise de m'avoir donné la parole.
Yes, the question I was going to ask so that you can address, Rina. Could you please tell us what are the main results of this vast and in-depth review process that the government is planning to use? Is there any concrete action taken to follow up on this analysis with an agenda for legislative reform? Thank you, Rina.
Merci Blaise et bonjour à tous les participants. D'emblée, je tiens à rappeler que les différentes annexes qui ont servi à l'élaboration du diagnostic ont été déjà partagées à plusieurs personnes et entités dans le ministère de l'Environnement et du Développement durable, le MED, et le ministère de l'Agriculture, de l'Élevage et de la Pêche, le MAEP. Cela a été une occasion non seulement de faire relire et valider le diagnostic, mais aussi de porter les résultats à la connaissance des différents acteurs ministériels et de leur permettre d'y apporter des contributions. L'important travail de collecte et d'analyse des textes juridiques réalisé par les consultantes a permis d'identifier un certain nombre de faiblesses, d'incohérences et de lacunes, tant au niveau du contenu que de l'articulation et de la mise en œuvre, ainsi que de l'application des textes. Il nous a permis d'avoir un meilleur aperçu du niveau de transposition en droit national, des obligations découlant des conventions internationales contraignantes en matière d'environnement. Par ailleurs, les interactions entre les conventions ainsi que la dimension multisectorielle des sujets relatifs à la faune sauvage et à l'environnement ont été mises en avant. Il sera ainsi de notre responsabilité de capitaliser ces acquis dans le cadre des réformes juridiques à venir. Pour le moment, le gouvernement s'intéressera particulièrement au cadre juridique relatif à la chasse, qui est ressorti du diagnostic comme étant des principales lacunes et faiblesses. En effet, il n'existe pas d'outils de planification et de gestion spécifiques à la chasse, que ce soit à l'échelle nationale ou locale. Les catégories et les zones de chasse ne sont pas clairement définies par la loi. L'encadrement de la chasse se fait essentiellement sur la base d'outils contractuels tels que cahiers des charges, plans d'aménagement et plans de gestion, dans le cadre de la gestion déléguée des aires protégées, des forêts et des ressources naturelles à des tierces comme ONG, communautés et secteur privé. Or, ces derniers ne sont pas toujours élaborés de manière participative et peinent souvent à refléter l'organisation et les règles coutumières, même malgré leur reconnaissance par la loi. En outre, ces outils ne sont pas forcément mis à jour régulièrement et ils sont rarement connectés au schéma d'aménagement du territoire et des plans d'occupation des terres adoptés par l'État, les régions ou les communes, ce qui nuit au développement durable et à la sécurité foncière des populations. En outre, en milieu rural et en milieu très reculé, les lois et les règlements ne sont souvent méconnus par les administrés, faute de publications adéquates, et ne sont pas toujours adaptés à la réalité du terrain, ce qui empêche leur bonne mise en œuvre et leur application. C'est un problème structurel dont l'administration a bien conscience. Même s'il ne peut pas être réglé dans ce seul programme, le travail qui a été réalisé apporte déjà une grande valeur ajoutée à l'information de l'administration et du public, grâce notamment à la cartographie et à la systématisation des instruments normatifs réalisés dans le cadre du SWM programme, qui est une étape fondamentale pour procéder à toute réforme. Concernant les mesures concrètes qui seront adoptées pour capitaliser les résultats des analyses, et parmi les recommandations et propositions de réforme législative faites par les consultantes et le programme, 3 chantiers sont apparus comme prioritaires pour le gouvernement. Premièrement, il s'agit de la révision de l'ordonnance 60-126, le régime de la chasse, de la pêche et de la protection de la faune à Madagascar. Pour ce faire, un groupe de travail multi-acteurs a été mis en place par le MED afin d'engager un dialogue avec toutes les parties prenantes, secteur public, secteur privé, ONG et associations, et recueillir des propositions techniques et juridiques destinées à améliorer la loi dans le cadre du contexte socio-économique du pays. Ce groupe de travail s'inscrit directement dans la continuité des actions du SWM programme. Il a vocation à diffuser auprès des participants, aussi grâce à la plateforme juridique présentée plus tôt par Eugenio, les résultats des analyses menées. Il s'agit de faire en sorte que tout le monde ait une même compréhension des règles existantes et des contraintes et problèmes juridiques relevés, quel que soit le parcours ou les connaissances initiales de chacun. L'objectif est que tous les acteurs puissent participer activement aux échanges sur les principaux axes de la réforme en apportant leurs connaissances, et ce, qu'ils viennent des ministères, de la société civile ou des centres de recherche. En combinant à la fois information et participation, le gouvernement espère renforcer les capacités de tous les acteurs et aboutir à une révision de l'ordonnance qui sera ainsi le fruit d'une réflexion commune, reflétant les aspirations de toutes les parties prenantes, valorisant aussi les pratiques premières qui vont dans le sens d'une gestion durable. Il est aussi prévu que le groupe de travail puisse s'appuyer sur les résultats des enquêtes de terrain menées auprès des communautés locales des sites du SWM programme. La première réunion de ce groupe de travail s'est tenue le 23 février et les vont suivre. Comme deuxième chantier, le gouvernement envisage également d'utiliser les analyses réalisées dans le cadre du travail d'évaluation du régime de la gestion des ressources naturelles par les communautés locales ou COPA, dans la mesure où, dans les sites du SWM programme, au parc naturel Makir, plusieurs contrats de gestion des COPA doivent être renouvelés. En intégrant l'évaluation de ces contrats à celle faite sur d'autres sites de transfert de gestion par d'autres partenaires, le gouvernement pourra disposer d'un échantillonnage de situations plus diversifié et donc de conclusions et recommandations plus riches et généralisables en l'ensemble du territoire national. Ce travail d'évaluation pourra s'accompagner d'échanges d'expériences entre les personnes qui s'occupent de ces contrats sur différents sites, afin d'avoir une démarche d'analyse harmonisée et commune. Il permettra également de fournir des informations utiles pour d'autres réformes législatives en cours, notamment celle sur la loi relative à la gestion locale des ressources naturelles, dite loi GELOS. Finalement, le troisième chantier sur lequel le ministère va travailler est celui de la mise en relation de la plateforme juridique en ligne Legalogue développée aujourd'hui dans le cadre du SWM programme avec les sites web du ministère et d'autres ministères, ainsi que le site Internet du Centre national légiste du gouvernement. L'objectif est d'assurer une diffusion aussi large que possible des informations qui y sont contenues et d'améliorer et encourager des processus de réforme participatifs dans tous les secteurs couverts par le diagnostic SWM programme, sur le modèle du groupe de travail détaillé précédemment. C'est notamment le cas déjà évoqué de la loi GELOS. Je ne saurais terminer mon intervention sans remercier l'Union européenne, la FAO et le FCS, l'équipe juridique du SWM, pour la réalisation de cette séance sur la mise en ligne de la plateforme juridique pour Madagascar. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rina, and thank you to the panelists for this very interesting and instructive session. I'm so sorry about that. I had to put my interpretation off so that I do not disturb you. So thank you again, Rina, for the presentation and the panelists for the interesting and instructive session. We have gone a little bit over time, but we will extend by a few minutes. Unfortunately, my boss, the legal counsel, Donata Rugarabamu, will not stay with us. So Donata, I would like to thank you very much for being with us. And as I said before, on behalf of the program, thanks for your support and the support of the legal office to the program and its implementation. But of course, if you're still with us after a few questions, we will be very happy to have you. Now, I've seen in the Q&A, there's a lot of questions, and I really appreciate those who have sent the questions in. Unfortunately, as you have had me mention, we have only a few minutes, and we might only deal with 4 or 5 questions of the questions that were sent in. Maybe I'm now committing the team, especially the coordinator, to probably send you answers to the questions, if we can record the questions and send the answers to those who have posed the questions, so that we get a lot of value, at least from this particular event going forward. So now, for the few questions that we have, I would like to ask some members of the panel. Let me start first by addressing the first question to our colleague Alain Billon, the result 1 focal point of the interim from CIRAD. Alain, thank you for being with us. Now, my question to you, as posed in the Q&A, is what kind of concrete contribution and added value do you expect from science in the context of the legal institutional work done in the framework of the program? Thank you, Alain.
Oui, merci pour cette question. Je vais répondre en français et donc sur la contribution finalement de la science dans le cadre de ce programme, je verrai 3 points. Il y a un premier point, c'est que bien sûr, on fait appel aux chercheurs, aux scientifiques, et d'ailleurs sous une approche interdisciplinaire avec des biologistes, mais aussi des économistes, des sociologues, des anthropologues, et ceci pour 3 raisons. D'abord, pour obtenir des connaissances nouvelles, bien sûr, et ces connaissances nouvelles vont être très utiles pour obtenir des éléments de décision à insérer dans les lois, comme des normes, des seuils, des standards, mais pas seulement. Il y a également des recherches sur les méthodes de concertation et les méthodes participatives. Elles sont très importantes et c'est un autre champ qui intéresse la science. Et puis, il y a un 3e volet où les chercheurs et la science ont des choses à faire dans les matières dans les questions de règlement et de loi. C'est pour contribuer au suivi de l'application, de l'acceptabilité également sociétale et puis aussi de l'efficacité des lois. Et donc, sur les contributions de chercheurs, on peut dire aussi qu'il y a bien sûr la méthode scientifique académique, bien connue de la science, mais il ne faut pas négliger non plus les savoirs locaux. Et donc, il y a ces 2 formes de collecte de connaissances qui sont complémentaires et il ne faut pas que l'une supplante l'autre. Donc ça, c'est le premier aspect, c'est la mobilisation des chercheurs. Un deuxième aspect où il y a des contributions finalement de la recherche, c'est finalement sur la recherche en droit en soi. Et il a été mentionné par exemple plusieurs fois la loi Gélos, pour rappeler qu'il y a des chercheurs qui ont contribué à faire émerger la loi Gélos. Ceux qui se souviennent, par exemple, j'ai un collègue Alain Bertrand qui a beaucoup contribué à faire émerger cette loi. Et donc, il y a véritablement des enjeux de recherche sur cette synergie entre le droit coutumier, le droit normatif. Et il y a des progrès probablement que SWIM peut aider à faire émerger, voire à publier pour faire avancer les concepts à ce sujet. Et je voudrais terminer sur un 3e point, c'est que ce dialogue entre les scientifiques et les juristes doit nécessairement s'insérer dans une dimension politique. Je veux dire par là que cette interface science et droit, elle n'a de portée que si elle est arbitrée par les politiques. Ce sont les politiques qui décideront des hauteurs, des normes et des standards et par exemple, sur leur acceptabilité. Les scientifiques voudront peut-être, par exemple, pour une pollution donnée, avoir un niveau de standard extrêmement élevé, mais le politique trouvera le seuil acceptable, qui sera peut-être moins élevé, mais qui sera compatible avec des enjeux économiques ou d'autres. Mais l'autre aspect où la science peut être utile, ce n'est pas que pour établir des normes, c'est aussi pour l'établissement, dans certains cas, d'un principe de précaution. En quel cas, on n'applique pas forcément une norme, mais on prend des précautions par rapport à des alertes levées par des scientifiques, mais on peut avoir effectivement des lois et des textes qui préviennent des dangers ou des risques sans forcément être capable de les chiffrer et de les insérer de cette façon dans la loi. Donc voilà les trois aspects que je voulais mentionner.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that. The second question which has been posed, and I would like to pose this question to our colleague Arnaud Guesson. So the second question is about the international conventions that were named throughout the panel discussion. The participants would like to know, how did you choose the international conventions in Annex 2A? And what are your selection criteria and how you have developed the indicators? Thank you, Arnaud.
Merci Blaise et bonjour tout le monde. Je vais aussi répondre en français. Pour répondre donc à cette question sur les annexes 2A qui traitent donc des conventions internationales, nous avons décidé en fait de nous focaliser sur les conventions qui sont contraignantes et qui ont été ratifiées par les pays dans lesquels le programme SWIM est en action. Donc, le but de cet exercice étant d'analyser la domestication des obligations, principes et les éléments des conventions internationales dans le droit national. Les conventions qui n'ont pas été ratifiées n'ont pas été inclus. C'est le cas de la Convention ILO 169 relative aux peuples indigènes et tribaux, malgré sa pertinence, bien entendu, dans le cadre de ce programme. Les déclarations et les instruments non contraignants n'ont pas été inclus car leurs analyses nécessitent de s'intéresser également aux droits souples et aux instruments volontaires. Et c'est le cas pour pas mal d'instruments comme la Déclaration des droits des peuples autochtones de 2007 et des directives volontaires de la FAO sur la gouvernance durable. Bien sûr, elles demeurent quand même pertinentes dans le cadre de ce programme et elles ont été intégrées en fait dans le cadre des sauvegardes sociales également développées par ce programme. Voilà, j'espère que ça répond à la question.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. I think that was a good response. Now, we have another question, and this is about the challenges and opportunities for sustainable wildlife management to work in the context characterized by the issue of legal pluralism. I would like to ask this question to Andrew Waddell. Andrew is the result one focal point from C4. If you could help us to answer the question, please, Andrew.
Many thanks, Blaise, and good afternoon to all the participants. What has been a very enriching webinar. I've also learned something, even though I've been involved in SWIM for the last 3 years, so that's encouraging. In relation to the question, Blaise, the context of the countries in which SWIM is working are all distinguished by many different sources of law. Legal pluralism and the jurisprudential precedents established under colonial rule have all resulted in very complex interactions between formal statutory laws and customary and informal justice systems. And here I'd like to acknowledge, Blaise, there's another question from a gentleman called Makweti, who's actually a member of the National Legal Consultant team in Zambia, who raised this issue as well too. So I wanted to highlight that we are fully cognizant of the legacies of colonial rule and the complexities that that has created. SWIM also recognizes the critical importance of customary and informal justice systems in trying to develop community-based approaches to sustainable wildlife management. Many features of customary and informal justice systems are particularly attractive to the poor, women, and remote and minority communities, particularly due to the familiarity and social authority of custom norms and processes, the relative cost effectiveness of customary norms and practices when compared with the direct, indirect, and opportunity costs of formal state justice systems, the geographic and linguistic accessibility, where most communities live in the areas where the disputants and adjudication take place in local languages. Very often, communities are characterized by having non-adversarial approaches to resolving disputes in communities by focusing on the future relationships within that community between the different parties in a broader social context, rather than simply relying on fines or punishments. And very often there is dissatisfaction with state-based solutions where state justice systems may be inaccessible, dysfunctional, or not available. So these all represent opportunities we can harness within SWIM. But I should mention, just to echo a comment that was raised by Eugenio, that the legitimacy of customary and informal justice systems is specific to particular sites and ethno-linguistic groups, and cannot therefore be extrapolated to other sites or the national level. In addition, there are challenges with customary and informal justice systems, which may include exclusionary norms and practices, unfair or discriminatory processes of decision-making, and lack of procedural safeguards, a lack of legal certainty, and the protection of women and marginalized populations, limited ability to enforce decisions, and the risks of elite capture, abuse, and corruption. Nevertheless, we have, in using the different diagnostic tools, identified in several of the countries where there are opportunities to harness the similarities between customary norms and practices and the provisions of statutory legislation, with the overall objective of advancing the rule of law and promoting sustainable wildlife management. And there, just as an example, I want to cite the case of Zimbabwe, since we haven't heard from Zimbabwe today, where, for example, customary prohibitions on killing animals, the so-called Silatonda traditions amongst the Tonga people, and Section 61 of the Parks and Wildlife Act 1975 represents one similarity. There are similarities in terms of prescribed hunting seasons. There are similarities in terms of provisions for floodplain hunting in the dry season. And there are similarities in terms of restrictions under both customary and strategic law on cutting wild fruit trees. So what the SWIM team is currently developing in collaboration with the site coordinators and the national focal points in each country is looking at statutory law reforms based on each national political agenda, but whilst also strengthening the recognition of well-functioning customary norms and practices that promote sustainable wildlife management at the site level. And last, Blaise, if you allow me, in response to a question that was written by Mohammed Ali Mekwa, in relation to how are we intending to recognize unwritten customary law in terms of the documentation of the legal hub, we are currently in discussions within the R1 SWIM team to develop short summaries of what we've learned through the use of the diagnostic tools as an additional tool possibly to upload eventually to the legal hub. So I hope that answers some of the questions that have been raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for answering the question from Ali Mekwa, who we know well because he's the former boss of the Development Law Service of the Legal Office. So I appreciate that reaching out to answer Ali's question. Colleagues, again, we are short of time. I will just ask the last question. I think the last question is to myself. We are grateful to our colleagues from the interpretation for staying with us a little bit more. So thank you very much for your time. The last question that was asked was in relation to what happens to the information provided in the legal hub, and what do we do with it after the SWM program finishes? And this question, I think, is addressed to the legal office. We know, for your information, the Development Law Service has a very vital and valuable asset, and that asset is called Faulex. It is the world's largest online repository of national laws and regulations and policies on food and agriculture and natural resource management, all the sectors that are of interest to the SWIM program. Recently, Faulex celebrated its 25th anniversary, and we are proud of this. Now, the legal hub is going to be incorporated, this is the plan, into a sectoral database, SWM Lex, under the Faulex group at the end of the program. So we are in agreement with the IT developer for the hub, which is CIRAD, so that we can ensure that all the sources, codes, technical specifications, and data stored in the legal hub can be transferred to FAO Legen, and that this will be in the appropriate format. As Faulex information is constantly updated, FAO Legen, that is the Development Law Service, will be able to incorporate the new legal documents stored in Faulex into SWM program. Into the SWM Lex, and we will make it possible to try to ensure that the legal hub is updated from time to time. So this is where I think, and I'm looking to our colleagues and the panelists, where we will end. I was going to pose another questions, but I know that we only have 3 minutes left. Maybe I will ask the question and I'll address it to Philippe Mayo. Philippe, I would like you to say something before we finish from here. So I'll address this question to you very quickly in 1 minute, if you can. During the presentation, you have referred to a community rights-based approach. Can you please clarify what you mean by that? Philippe, please.
I'm mute, no, maybe?
Yes.
Where is it? I don't find it anymore. No, I'm okay. Thank you, Blaise. I will try to be extremely fast. So community rights-based approach is really an emanation also of the human rights-based approach. It is really, as I said, at the heart of the EU values. And it has two goals, two targets. First of all, it's really to empower indigenous people, local communities to claim their rights, because they are the holders of the rights. But also, the second part is to give, to strengthen the capacity of the other actors that must respect the rights of the local communities and indigenous people. So it's really a way to, the two categories of stakeholders must improve their capacity. One of the most important tools is really the FPIC, so the Free Prior Informed Consent, where the local communities are really consulted and they can refuse a program. For the moment, we have some cases where the definition of new national parks are really questioned by the FPIC procedure. So that's the total right of the right holders of the region. And so that's really something extremely important. And I must say that you should be proud that the manual that was developed in the STREAM program is really something that we show as a model for all the programs that now we are funding in many countries. And that's really, recently there were some concerns about the kind of green colonialism and so on, but it's not that at all. It's really the way that nature satisfies the needs of the local people. And that's really something that is really a model. And the big book on the community rights-based approach that the SWIM program has developed is really a model, and you should be proud of it.
Thank you very much, Philippe. And now to really close, I think the session, the event has been very useful, and we cannot ask for more than what has been given. So it all remains now for me to say thank you. First of all, thank you to Philippe, to you, and through you to the European Union for supporting this program. And then also I would like to take this opportunity to be to appreciate the work the team has put in and the background work in also preparing for this event. I would also like to thank we have good updates on the SWIM program, and this is very useful to inform our partners as well as the countries who are beneficiaries of the program on the work that we're doing, and it keeps them up to date. So we thank you for that. I would like to take this opportunity to also thank very much the FAO Forestry Department that hosts the program, and salute the very good example of in-house collaboration that we've had, especially between the legal office and the FAO Forestry Department. We appreciate it very much. And then I would finally like to thank all the panelists and the attendees for the rich discussion that we've had. And I want to wish the SWM program colleagues to well and to continue the invaluable commitment to reach the key objective of designing and implementing actions that achieve both human development goals and wildlife conservation, to subsequently adapt and replicate those viable solutions in many other countries if the program ends. So with that, I thank you all for your participation, and I wish you a good day, a good evening, or good morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much.